Good Tuesday morning, and welcome to another edition of the Here We Go podcast. I'm your host, Trent Ging. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that came up a couple of nights ago when I was talking on X, and it really plays into something that Colin and I talked about on our last full-length episode. So, how did the Steelers acquire their quarterback of the future? Now, it's very unlikely, in my opinion, that one of these two guys, in Russell Wilson or Justin Fields, are going to be the quarterback of the future for a number of reasons. The first, a 35-year-old quarterback who, quite honestly, hasn't had a significant drop-off in his play. I mean, the first year in Denver was terrible, but so was the coaching staff. So how much of that do you attribute to Russ learning a new system and just not performing? How much of that do you attribute to the coaching staff's ineptitude and, they weren't there very long and they were gone, right? I just don't. There was a lot that went wrong there. His second year under Sean Payton, the numbers weren't terrible outright. If you look a little deeper into it and you see about how many checkdowns he had and this and that, now that part's concerning, of course. I don't expect a huge bounce back here from Russell Wilson. And I know that I feel like the team, and I know a lot of fans, and I know a lot of media members are expecting this big bounce back year from him, but I'm just not convinced it's going to happen. Now, on the Justin Fields front, typically once a guy struggles enough as a first-round pick and he's given away for basically nothing, those guys don't usually turn into Hall of Fame type guys, Pro Bowl type guys, All Pro type guys. The Steve Youngs of the world just don't happen very often. Tampa gave up on Steve Young. He goes to San Francisco. He sits for a couple of years, and then all of a sudden, this dude's on a Hall of Fame trajectory. That does not happen very often. And Mike Tomlin, surely as hell, is not Bill Walsh. So I'm very hopeful for Justin Fields. I really am. I love the kid. I've liked him since he came to Ohio State. He has a ton of talent, but I'm not sure. I think his biggest issue, honestly, is he does not process the speed of the game fast enough. And I'm not sure if that's something that can be taught. You can teach a guy to start working through progressions better, but can you teach them to process the progressions fast enough to really improve? And if he does learn that, he could turn into something. We don't know. But I'm not going to bank on it because history is against him in this scenario. And the same with Russell Wilson. A team doesn't typically dump a quarterback for $38 million because he and the head coach don't get along. There's something they see in Russell that he's not worth that price tag. And in today's current quarterback market, $38 million really isn't top tier money, let's be honest. You got a lot of guys starting to pull in $50 million a year. $38 million, you're looking at that next tier down. So they say he's not even next tier down material, even with the second season under Sean Payton. So I think history's against this thing working out for the Steelers and getting both guys. Probably not going to be what they expect. So where do you go from there? Well, Colin and I talked about free agency is atrocious next year. It's Dak Prescott or don't do it. And you believe Dak Prescott can take you to the next level if you pay a guy like that? Because he's going to get a large payday. But he's not shown he's a very playoff caliber type player once he's gotten there. So how much do you believe in Dak? Do you think you should give him that kind of money? That'll come up. So then how do you get a top tier quarterback? So I did a little digging. There's a list on ESPN of former scouts and I think GMs that voted on the top 10 quarterbacks in the NFL right now. Of the top 10 quarterbacks in the NFL right now, 3 of those top 10 were not drafted inside the top 15. And only one of those were not drafted in the first round at all. Now, I'm not saying the list was 100% rock solid, because I think there's arguments that can be made. Dak Prescott was the only guy on the list who was not drafted in the first round. Aaron Rodgers and Lamar Jackson were the other 2 guys who were not drafted inside the top 15. Now, there are some guys up and coming who were not on that list that I think you could start moving into that conversation. Based on the play last year, I think Jordan Love might be somebody you could throw in there. I definitely think a guy like Jalen Hurts, who was not on that list, should be in the conversation. He would have been another guy on that list that wouldn't have been drafted inside the top 15, and so would have Jordan Love. But the odds of getting a top-tier quarterback outside the top 15 is not very strong. So somebody I was talking to said, well, look at the last 25 years of quarterbacks. Quarterbacks who won the Super Bowl. So I did. And then I asked myself, why is he going back 25 years? This game has changed drastically over the last 25 years. Well, it's because in order to make his point, he had to go back 25 years to find guys not drafted in the top 15. If you look at the last 20 years, there's only 3 in 20 years not drafted inside the top 15. So then, of course, the argument comes up about Matthew Stafford. He wasn't drafted by the team that he won the Super Bowl with, and Peyton Manning. Okay, I get that. How many organizations are going to let a guy like Matthew Stafford go? I'm sorry, but if you have a franchise quarterback, those guys aren't going anywhere. The organizations are paying them anything they want to keep them there. So you're not going to find that guy laying around and just be able to I'm just going to make a trade to go get my guy. No team's going to be desperate enough to make that trade twice. That's an outlier trade. That is not the regular, everyday offseason type of trade. Peyton Manning was a whole different situation. The Colts thought he was they thought he was going to medically retire, so they drafted his replacement. They weren't sure he was going to be able to play the game again. So again, this is another outlier situation. These are not normal, everyday things. In order to get the quarterback you want, who is going to be a top-tier quarterback, the numbers suggest you have to go draft that guy, and you have to draft him inside the top 15. Now the question comes up, how do you get that guy? Well, you could do 2 things. You could trade up in the draft, or you could lose, so that you're picking inside that top 15 range. So the idea of tanking comes up. Now here's where I stand on tanking. Because I used this term the other night on X, and honestly, I should have used a different term, because when I think of how the Steelers would tank, I don't think they would go to the levels of what Miami did when they were tanking for Tua. I don't think they would go through the levels that Houston did in order to get themselves in position to get C.J. Stroud. You're not going to sell off a lot of your good pieces. Now, in order, I think the Steelers would be willing to lose enough, maybe not intentionally, But just maybe this thing doesn't work out this year and they finish 7-10 with such a difficult schedule that they could end up in the top 15 organically without trying. Maybe Russell doesn't play well enough. Maybe Justin doesn't play well enough. They lose enough games in this gauntlet schedule that we have on the back end, and they end up 7-10 anyway, which is going to put them close in that top 15 range. And if they only win 6 games, you can pretty much guarantee they're going to be in that top 15 range. So, number one, the scenario isn't that outside the realm of possibilities. I know people are going to say, oh, well, our team got much better. Well, so did the teams we're playing against. Yes, this team did improve. But do you really think a 35-year-old Russell Wilson is going to drastically change his play as opposed to what we saw in the last few weeks of the season from Mason Rudolph? Because I don't. And I don't like Mason Rudolph. I never liked him as a quarterback. But his play at the end of the season is pretty close to being as good as what you're going to see out of Russell Wilson. And I think that's your bar. So you can win some games, but are you going to win games if all of these teams can stay healthy, which of course they won't. So this whole dynamic will change as the season plays out. Fans better prep themselves for a chance that we could be anywhere from a team that wins a playoff game to a team that finishes this season with 6 or 7 wins. That's kind of our range. That's our ceiling and floor. And if we're on the downside of that thing, you could be drafting inside the top 15. And then you might look at making moves in the offseason to acquire picks so you can trade up in this draft to go get your quarterback of the future, because that's where this needs to go. Now, it'll be interesting to see if this class develops and turns into a really solid class, or if they're going to have 1 or 2 guys at the top of this class and the rest of it isn't that strong. But when I think of tanking, the Steelers are not a team and an organization. They're going to do this all-out tank where they sell off all their good players and they have to try to get that first pick overall. They're never going to do that. That's not built into their DNA. So tanking for the Steelers are losing enough games to get inside the top 15. And I still am not convinced they're willing to do that. Not intentionally. But should they? If they have a guy they really believe in this class, and it's very abundant that this team is not going to the playoff and they're not going to win, I'd be okay with it, to be perfectly honest with you, because this quarterback carousel we're playing right now is not going to work. We have become the Cleveland Browns that we made fun of for 20 years. So, again, I'm intrigued by guys like Quinn Ewers and Cam Ward. And I know really Jackson Dart's name just keeps popping. Every time I see something about preseason All-Americans, guys who are going to be skyrocketing up the draft boards, this dude shows up on every list. So I'm not sure what people are seeing that I haven't, because I'll be honest, I haven't watched him play yet. But his name keeps jumping up off the page on every list, and he's being talked about by some places as a first overall pick. So I want to see this play out so I can watch some of these guys to try to get a better gauge on what I truly think. But as of right now, if I had to pick 2 guys that I would want the Steelers to go after that I think realistically could be there for them, it's Quinn Ewers and Cameron Ward. Because even though Ward's an older guy that I typically don't like, I think this guy's been tucked away at Washington State and has not gotten the national attention that he deserves because he's a good player. He has a lot to like in his skill set. Is it worth it to trade up for a guy like either one of them? As of right now, I think if Pittsburgh has a season like they did last year, and let's say they do finish 9-8 again, which I think is kind of where some organizations are picking him, he could be a guy that falls down in that 20s range, which 9-8 got us the 20th pick last year and probably be in that same range again this year. So, listen, I'm not for all-out tanking like what Miami did because, I mean, look at what Miami has had to do. They've rebuilt for a number of years to simply make the playoffs. Well, we're making the playoffs here and there right now. So why would you sell off everything just to get one quarterback and then have to rebuild the entire roster around that quarterback? Because there were serious conversations about Tua not getting extended because he wasn't any good. Mike McDaniel, of course, changed that narrative with the way he's changed that offense, and Tua has thrived in that offense. But the conversations were still being had either way. Why put a quarterback in that position where you have nothing to support him? Right now, this Steelers team is going very young on the offensive side. They're putting the building blocks in place. It's just a matter of finding the right guy who can take the reins on that and run with it, which is another reason, among many reasons, why I don't want Russell Wilson to be extended here. Unless he shows something that I'm not seeing that suggests he could take this team to the promised land and win a Super Bowl, I'm not all for it. You have a very young offense. Put a young quarterback with that offense. Watch them grow together. That's my mindset. The defense is going to have to start getting younger. That's probably the plan moving through next year and into the next couple of seasons, is making this defense younger. And even moves like Patrick Queen and getting Joey Porter Jr. and the draft last year, getting a guy like Peyton Wilson, who they see a lot of potential in this draft, getting a guy like Keanu Benton on the defensive line. You can see them making moves at each level outside of safety that suggest they want this defense to start getting younger. It's not just out of necessity. They're starting to put the pieces in place to allow these guys to move on. And I expect a very high draft pick spent either a first or second round, depending on how things fall this year, on another defensive lineman. And you're probably going to see another corner in the top 3 picks and another receiver somewhere in it. I mean, we have options to make things younger, but I think that defense definitely needs to keep getting younger. So if Justin Fields and Russell Wilson don't work out this year, I don't think they need to all out sell the farm and tank, because that just doesn't work. If they lost enough games to get themselves inside that top 15, then you bring up a lot of options to get a guy, whether it's to trade up a little bit, like what Kansas City did with Patrick Mahomes, or if a guy could fall to you at 15 or somewhere in that range. It'll be really interesting to see how things play out this year, because I think of all the things that we are talking about, everybody's talking about the right now with the current wide receiver predicament, the slot corner predicament. Outside of that, most of the roster has been set. There's some camp battles that'll still go on, of course. But I think you could easily predict the roster from here, outside of those 2 spots. But what people aren't talking about a lot is what do we do beyond this year with the quarterback position? Because I still think it's going to be on very shaky ground well into this season. So it's just an interesting topic that came up, and I wanted to clarify my position on it, because when I say tanking in the Steelers, I don't think of tanking with the Steelers the same way that I do the Dolphins. I mean, this organization's shown they're willing to do whatever it takes to finish at least 500 or better and keep Tomlin's streak alive. But we've not done enough to make sure we get over that hump and actually go somewhere in the playoffs and win games. So let's see how that plays out. This is more filler content right now. We're still in that dead period. We're getting ready to start camp. Then we'll get some more, conversations going around what actual play on the field looks like, which is what I'm really excited for. But I hope you all like the content. Share. Please tell me your thoughts on this subject because I'm really curious if anybody's thought this out. And share. Hope y'all have a great day.